I would like to start by quoting John from the New Testament in the Bible. In John chapter 8, verse 7, Jesus says, "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." Then in verse 15, Jesus says, "Ye judge after the flesh, I judge no man. And yet if I judge, my judgment is true." Jesus knows me, and Jesus understands me. I mourn with all of you who mourn, my children and Tammy. Jesus Christ knows the truth of what happened here.
So what you just heard is testimony given by Lori Daybell. And in this testimony, she's describing her two children as being happy and busy in the spirit world. The reason she's referring to them in this manner is because she's now standing trial for their murders. In this video, we're going to look at the Vallow Daybell Doomsday murders, where this lady right here, Lori Daybell, and her husband Chad Daybell are now standing trial for a series of murders, including child murder, filicide, and spousal murder. Now, filicide is a deliberate act of a parent killing their own child. The couple were leaders of a Mormon religious sect that's now being dubbed by the media as a doomsday cult. Hi you guys, welcome back. So I thought I'd switch it up a bit and take a little break from the Tiffin fiasco. In this video, I'll be touching on the Vallow Daybell Doomsday Murder Trial. Now let me say this, I've always found cults fascinating, and it's not that I like them or admire them. What interests me is how people find themselves consumed in these cults, and also how the leaders of those cults can calculate the full manipulation and total control over their followers' minds. Because I believe that once you have control over someone's mind, then you have control over every aspect of their life. So a cult is defined as a relatively small group of people having religious beliefs or practices regarded by others as strange or sinister. Now, one could argue that churches are cults, but the majority of society accept churches and often don't see them as a threat to the rest of society. Now, what I feel separates cults from churches is that the followers within that cult are expected to do any and everything for their leader, and that includes laying down their own life. So when they're willing to lay down their own life, what else are they willing to do? Let's take for instance the Tokyo subway sarin attack. This was an act of domestic terrorism that was carried out in Tokyo, Japan by the Shinrikyo cult on March 20th, 1995 in Tokyo, Japan. The cult released sarin, which is a nerve agent that is one of the most toxic of the known chemical warfare agents and is generally odorless and tasteless. Exposure to sarin can cause death within minutes. So that was the toxic gas that the Shinrikyo cult decided to release upon unsuspecting everyday citizens trying to travel from one place to another on a train during rush hour. In result, the Shinrikyo cult was responsible for killing 13 people, severely injuring 50, some of whom later died as well, and causing temporary vision problems for nearly 1,000 others. So besides that horrific account of terrorism by that cult, there are several other accounts of different cults that have not only caused harm and death to their own members, but have also caused harm and death to the rest of society around them. And maybe we'll dive into some other ones down the line, but first, let's get back to the Vallow Day Doomsday murders. So let's talk about Lori. And we're going to go a little bit into her past just to see what type of environment and what type of belief systems that she was exposed to at a very young age. Because I think knowing about some of the elements that people were exposed to as children really gives us an insight into why they do some of the things they do as adults. And I'm by no means excusing this monster for what she did to her children. It just gives us an idea of the seeds that were planted early on that may have contributed to the forest of terror we now see before us. So Lori Ryan Daybell, also known as Lori Vallow Daybell, was actually born Lori Noreen Cox. She was born on June 26, 1973 in Loma Linda, California. She grew up in a Mormon family, and what I found really interesting is that her parents adhered to a sovereign citizen ideology. And so people who live by this ideology have their own pseudo-legal belief system based on misinterpretations of common law, and they claim not to be subject to any government statutes unless they consent to them. And the FBI has called sovereign citizens anti-government extremists who believe that even though they physically reside in this country, they are separate or sovereign from the United States. So basically, they don't believe in like driver's license. They don't believe in social security cards. They don't believe in insurance, things like that. They don't believe in paying taxes. And that's why her parents actually ended up on the wrong side of the IRS at one point because of their strong belief in this type of ideology. So we can see where those seeds of total devotion to some type of ideology or belief system were planted in Lori in her early stages of her life. Lori also has several marriages under her belt. She married her first husband in 1992 at the age of 19. He was also her high school boyfriend at the time, but the marriage soon ended shortly afterwards. And then in October 1995, Lori married again and had a son named Colby in 1996. She then divorced in 1998. She worked for some time as a hairdresser, and in 2004, she was a contestant in the Miss Texas beauty pageant, and she was also on Wheel of Fortune. Now, I found the fact that she was involved in beauty pageants really interesting because if we look at, the court proceedings and look at her pictures, you can see she's always trying to be dolled up. You can tell it's important for her to try to have her hair looking good and have on makeup, even though, lady, you're in jail. Okay, give it up. But that's still important to her for some reason. So getting back to all these marriages. Okay, so in 2001, Lori married Joseph Anthony Ryan Jr., who legally adopted Colby, who was her son from her previous marriage, okay, which she divorced in 1998. And the couple's biological daughter, Tylee, was born in 2002. So then she went on to have her daughter Tylee with Joseph Anthony Ryan Jr. Lori and Ryan divorced in 2005. After the divorce, a bitter custody battle ensued, during which she accused him of sexually assaulting their children. So Ryan eventually lost custody. Lori's son Colby eventually revealed during an interview that he had been sexually abused by Ryan. And so Ryan was later found dead in 2018 in his apartment due to what they're calling a heart attack. But after Lori's arrest in 2020, and after a recording surfaced in which she mentioned wanting to kill Ryan like Neffy killed, quote unquote, police reviewed Ryan's death, but they still found no foul play. So before we get to this other marriage of Lori's, which is the reason why all this is happening, because two crazy people got together, okay? Basically, there's no other way to say it. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. Why does she have so many marriages under her belt? Well, as I mentioned before, she is part of the Mormon religion. So I did a little quick Google search about premarital sex and Mormons and what their beliefs are on that subject. And so basically they forbid premarital sex. It says sex before and outside of a monogamous heterosexual marriage is strictly forbidden by Mormon teachings. Okay? So I think that pretty much says it there. She's finding these guys that she's really, wanting to be with and do things with, but then she's still torn between her religion. So therefore they have to go and get married first before they get down to the nitty gritty. All right. But let's move on. And let's move on to Lori's fourth marriage. So in February 2006, Lori married Leland Charles Anthony Vallow, who usually went by Charles. And in 2013, the couple adopted Charles's grandnephew, Joshua Jackson, affectionately known as JJ. And they adopted him because his parents were unable to care for him due to their substance abuse. And due to that abuse, JJ was born with drugs in his system and spent time in the neonatal intensive care unit. And as a baby, JJ was taken care of for nearly a year by his grandparents, Kay and Larry Woodcock, before being adopted by Charles. And JJ was eventually diagnosed with autism. So let's get to Lori's fifth husband. And half of the reason why all of this is happening, because two crazy people found each other. Let's get a little bit of a background on Chad first. He was born on August 11, 1968, also to a Mormon family in Provo, Utah. He grew up in the neighboring city of Springville. After graduating high school, Chad successfully enrolled in Brigham Young University And after just 1 year of college, he applied to be a missionary and spent 2 years in New Jersey pursuing that passion. After New Jersey, he resumed his studies at BYO and graduated with a BA in journalism. On March 9, 1990, he married Tamara Douglas, also known as Tammy, and Tammy we will get to later. And together they had 5 children. For some time, Chad worked as a copy editor for the Standard Examiner in Ogden. During and after his studies, he would work as a cemetery sexton for Springville and also as a gravedigger. In 1999, Chad successfully completed and published his first religion-themed novel titled An Errand for Emma. He then went on to quit his work at the cemetery to focus on his writing and eventually publish another book called 1 Foot in the Grave, which was a nonfiction book that chronicled his experiences while working in cemeteries. Chad and his wife Tammy would later open a business in 2004 where he could self-publish his beliefs regarding the end times and other religion-themed books, all of which he aimed towards the Latter-day Saint audience. Their privately owned company was called the Spring Creek Book Company, but it soon went out of business due to financial issues. So with the business only bringing in an annual income of $2,000, both Lori and Chad had to get part-time jobs, and Chad went back to work in cemeteries. Chad would eventually go on to become a popular author, writing about some of the radical Mormon circles. Chad also wrote novels about apocalyptic and dystopian futures. One of the recurring themes in his books would be the presence of a spiritual or supernatural voice that would give him advice or give advice and guidance to his characters in the books, characters of which he often fashioned after his own family members. Some would often wonder about Chad's writing creativity. In response, Chad claimed to have near-death experiences and that due to those experiences, he now possessed a connection to the afterlife, and that he receives information from what he calls beyond the veil. And this is one of his direct quotes about how he experiences those beyond the veil moments. He said, "I don't fictionalize any of the events portrayed in my books. I'm really not that creative. My torn veil allows information to be downloaded into my brain from the other side. The scenes I am shown are real events that will happen." So let's talk about where he says, the scenes I am shown are real events that will happen. What stood out to me in that statement is when he says these are real events that will happen. I feel like he's saying that he can prophesize or see into the future. So basically, Chad and Lori started what's called an end of the world cult, or what's also called a doomsday cult, which sounds a bit more dramatic, right? And usually these are the most extreme cults. Because how more extreme can you get, right? You're literally proclaiming to know the exact date and in some cases the exact time that the world will end. So many of the people who are involved in these kind of cults just become more and more extreme as time goes on because they feel they will soon reach that climax of the end of the world. So just imagine for a minute that you're a child and both of your parents are constantly brainwashing you with these types of beliefs. So you live in constant fear that the world is going to end, and of course that you're going to end with it, right? But cults like this usually have the most devoted following because they prey on what most humans fear, and that's death and the unknown of what comes after death. And that's just my opinion, you guys. I'm not a professional in any of this. I'm just giving my opinion as I go along and as I, read through this case and how these people are and what type of cult this was. And so once leaders within these type of cults establish the fear within their followers, they then can insert their extreme beliefs, and there's always a fear factor element within those belief systems. For example, telling people that if they don't get rid of their worldly possessions and cease contact with all the outside world or people who are not in agreement with the cult, then they will face horrific consequences in the afterlife. So just like other leaders of end-of-the-world cults, Chad's religious beliefs soon became increasingly extreme. Chad would claim to have visions about how the world would end, and in 2013, he began prophesying that there would be earthquakes, destruction, and war in the Americas. So this is a good example of how these cult leaders use normal things like natural disasters and tragic events, to plant seeds of fear into the minds of their followers. Because by him prophesying that there would be earthquakes, destruction, and war in the Americas is basically like saying, hey, a volcano might erupt sooner or later, okay? Because these kinds of things have already happened in the Americas. There have been earthquakes, there's been destruction, and war at times. So it's not far-fetched to say that some of those things would happen again in the future. So once the leaders establish these kind of so-called prophecies to their followers, they can then go back to them when a natural disaster happens or when there's like rioting or protesting in the streets and use those events as a tool of evidence to further their credibility as a so-called prophet. During and around 2010, Chad helped a self-proclaimed clairvoyant author named Julie Rowe publish books about apocalyptic end-time prophecies. Julie also claimed to have connections to the spirit world, making Julie and Chad very popular amongst Mormon preppers. Those Mormon preppers had a strong belief that the end of the world was near, so they would prep for it and even considered moving into tent cities in anticipation for Doomsday. Another author named Suzanne Freeman, who also had books published by Chad, said she had to distance herself from him due to his extremism and deviation from Mormon teachings. Suzanne also felt his beliefs were dangerous. Chad eventually moved from Utah to Rexboro, Idaho, because a voice told him to. So with that, he and Tammy, his wife I mentioned earlier, moved from Utah to Rexboro, Idaho. So now let's talk about how Lori and Chad met. Around 2015, Lori became a fan of Chad's Standing in Holy Places book series. Over the coming years, her interest in books about extreme religious beliefs and near-death experiences intensified, and she also enjoyed listening to podcasts by excommunicated Mormons. So when a church decides to excommunicate someone, the church will exclude them from membership and participation in church or religious community. This is done when there is an extreme violation to the church's doctrines and standards. So some examples of things that might get someone excommunicated are crimes like murder, child abuse, and incest. Also, sexual immorality, specifically adultery, involvement in homosexual conduct, and participation in an abortion. So I think that most of society would agree that the first three violations of doctrine are not just specific to Mormon religion. The majority of society see murder, child abuse, and incest as deplorable acts. But the question that came to my mind when I read these sins and violations was, what do Mormons do when they find out another Mormon has murdered, abused a child, or committed incest? Do they give that person the option to repent for those type of sins? Or do they report them to the authorities, especially in the cases of child abuse and murders? So I asked Google that question, and this is what I found. So come down this rabbit hole with me. We're going to consult history just a little bit. So through my research, I found something called blood atonement. So there was a religious leader and politician named Brigham Young, and he was the second president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, LDS Church for short. He was also the first governor of the Utah Territory for 7 years from February 1851 through April of 1858. He was a polygamist who had about 56 wives, give or take. You know, there's some debate on that. And 57 children. Yes, 57. One of the doctrines he taught was referred to as blood atonement. And it laid out how covenant breakers, usually adulterers and apostates, would have to pay for their sins. Apostates are people who renounce their religious or political beliefs and principles. Brigham Young's first reported teachings of blood atonement was in 1845. It was said that Young approved the killing of a Mormon by an unknown person in Novo, Illinois, and that Young referred to the killing as a deed of charity. And Young also added, he might now possibly be redeemed in the eternal world, when he was referring to the deceased Mormon person. In 1852, during a speech before the Utah Territory's legislature, Young appeared to favor a law that would allow the decapitation of whites who were condemned by the law for miscegenation with black people. Miscegenation is a derogatory term describing sexual relationships or reproduction between people of different ethnic groups, especially when one of them is white. Brigham Young said that miscegenation was a grave sin that would bring a curse upon a man and all of his children that were produced as a result of the union. Young also said that if a white Mormon in an unguarded moment should commit such a transgression, decapitation would do a great deal towards atoning for the sin. He said it would do them good that they might be saved with their brethren. He also said it is the greatest blessing that could come to some men to shed their blood on the ground and let it come up before the Lord as an atonement. Now, this is some heavy stuff I ran into, and I could go on and on down this rabbit hole, but let's get back on track to the Lori and Chad Doomsday cult. So after reading a bit of history on the roots of Mormonism and the roots of the LDS church movement, I feel that some of those extreme beliefs, such as blood atonement, which I understood to basically be murder or self-deletion, I feel these kind of extreme beliefs may still exist for some people, but not for people who identify as modern Mormons, specifically the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They do not believe in the doctrine of blood atonement. They reject the idea that individuals should shed their own blood to atone for their sins, as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints believes that salvation is found through the atonement of Jesus Christ. I felt it was important for me to add that information in because even though I'm mostly ignorant to the majority of the Mormon lifestyle, I did spend some time researching, so hopefully I don't sound completely dumb or unknowingly insult someone who is part of that group. Because since I know firsthand how it feels, I do my best not to group people together and judge a whole religion or race on the past actions of their ancestors. But I feel it's important to know history and what extremes people will go to, all in the name of religion or faith. So that being said, just take that as a little disclaimer to anything I mentioned that might have offended anyone. That is not my intention. My intention is to report on this case, and through reporting on this case, give some insight into the behaviors of Lori and Chad Daybell. Alright, let's continue with the discussion on how Lori and Chad met. Lori attended a Preparing the People event in 2018 where she met Chad for the very first time. Preparing a People is a doomsday preparation focused series of events organized by a Mormon multimedia company called Color My Media. The stated goal of these events is to prepare the people of this earth for the second coming of Jesus Christ. Chad was a keynote speaker for the event and gave lectures for the group on several occasions. Lori was reportedly acting very flirtatious towards Chad at this Preparing a People conference, and Chad further stroked the fires of their mutual intrigue by telling Lori that they had been married in multiple previous lifetimes. Lori and Chad then began communicating privately afterwards. When Lori's husband went on a business trip, this gave Lori the opportunity to hold a small overnight gathering at her home. Chad was amongst the guests, of course. During this gathering, Chad was able to captivate Lori and the group by sharing his Mormon influence yet unique beliefs. Lori found herself strongly attracted to Chad and his teachings, and the two would eventually become lovers. Chad's teachings attracted a group of followers, and he and Lori would tell them that they belonged to the Church of the Firstborn and that Chad was the leader. Lori and Chad had extreme beliefs that they wholeheartedly believed in. One of those beliefs was reincarnation, and this tied into Chad's theory that he had lived multiple past lives, not one, not two, not three, but he claimed to have lived 31 previous lives, okay? And that they were on different planets. Chad also believed that Lori had lived 21 past lives, and 5 of them had coincided with his own experiences here on Earth. Lori was once a co-host on a radical religious podcast with another host named Gibb. And when Gibb questioned Lori and Chad about why they hadn't divorced their spouses, Lori said that they were not allowed to because of the information they were receiving from the other side of the veil. Chad believed that their past life served as a probationary period in order for one to reach exaltation. Exaltation is a belief in Mormonism that after death, some people will reach the highest level of salvation in the celestial kingdom and eternally live in God's presence. They believe they will continue as families, become gods, create worlds, and make spirit children over whom they will govern. Another part of Chad and Lori's belief system was that they judged people on a scale from what they called light and dark. Light standing for Jesus Christ and dark for Satan. They believed that the dark people were possessed by evil spirits, and they would perform what was called a casting ceremony to get rid of the evil spirits. Chad and Lori claimed that some people who were possessed could not be saved by the casting ceremonies because they could turn into zombies, and then the only way to get rid of the zombies was to kill the person. Yeah, they're going there, I guess. They're going to zombies. This whole thing is so bizarre. It just gets even more extreme as we go along. So let's continue. They also believed in scoring people on a vibration scale. This told them if the person had special powers or if the person could be translated. In Mormonism, translation refers to being physically changed by God from a mortal human being to an immortal human being. Lori and Chad also believed that they could teleport through light and dark portals, and that he used those portals to interact spiritually with Lori. Chad also claimed that he received revelations through the portals. Yeah, it's a lot. So this next belief of theirs, I feel really gives us an insight into the mind of Lori and Chad Daybell and tells us about the degree of self-importance and delusion Chad and Lori had eventually reached. So in true Doomsday Cult fashion, Chad told his followers that the world would end on July 22nd, 2020. He claimed to be guided by angels and that he could see hidden truths. And Lori said she could communicate directly with God and Jesus. Lori believed that she was an exalted goddess with visionary powers and that she and Chad were going to lead 144,000 people who would survive the ending of the world. Lori believed that since she was an exalted being, she was exempt from being held accountable for any of her actions here on earth. And so that segues us into the next part of this, and that is the killing of Charles Vallow, Lori's fourth husband. So now with Chad and Lori's extreme belief systems in full effect, Lori began to act on these beliefs. She first told her then husband, Charles Vallow, that she no longer cared about him or JJ. She then vanished for 58 days. Yes, almost 2 months, okay? Charles then filed for divorce, saying that his truck was stolen and $35,000 was taken from his and Lori's joint bank account. Charles said Lori accused him of being possessed by a dark spirit and that if he got in her way of carrying out her mission to lead the 144,000 people at the Christ's second coming, then she would murder him. Charles took the advice of his attorney and attempted to get a protective order against Lori, but he soon changed his mind in hopes of salvaging the marriage. But then, upon becoming increasingly worried about Lori's continued actions, Charles decided to change the beneficiary of his $1 million life insurance policy from Lori to his sister Kay, which was a detail that Lori was unaware of until after Charles' death. During the investigation into Charles' death, detectives uncovered text messages between Chad, Lori, and Lori's brother Alex, where they talked about Charles as being possessed by a spirit, and Lori told members of her religious group that Charles had become a zombie. So several of her followers began to pray for his demise. Charles had discovered Lori and Chad's affair and tried to tell Chad's wife Tammy about the affair through email, but was unsuccessful. So Chad planned to meet Tammy in person to tell her about her husband and his wife's affair. On July 11, 2019, Charles went to Lori's home to pick up JJ. Lori's brother Alex Cox was at the home at the time and claimed to have confronted Charles about him abusing his sister. Cox claimed to have been hit by Charles, so in self-defense, he shot him. Lori made no attempts to call 911 after the shooting, and it was later determined that her brother Alex Cox waited about 45 minutes to call authorities after the shooting. A detective said Lori seemed unaffected by the events that had happened that day, and neighbors even reported that Lori had a pool party with loud music the same day Charles was killed. Lori sent her brother a text message just 2 days before the shooting, telling Alex to, quote, "be like Nephi." And Nephi is one of the central figures described in the Book of Mormon who was prompted by the Holy Spirit to kill someone who was perceived as wicked. and police interpreted this message as Lori commanding Alex to kill Charles. In the days following Charles's murder, Chad sent Lori a series of text messages detailing their sexual relationship, and investigators likened the messages to a romance novel. Well, you guys, there's so much more to this story. I am going to end it here today. I will pick back up on this on my next video. But if you guys enjoyed this, please let me know down in the comments. I will continue on with this case. This is an active case going on right now. These events took place some time back, but now this case is active and going, and they're trying to get her convicted and the husband convicted of just all these murders. So that's going to be part 1 of it today, you guys. If you enjoyed the video, please remember to leave it a like. And if you're new here, subscribe.